The night Eliza Harrow left the world, the town remembered only its quiet. No sirens tearing through the dark, no frantic shouting on the street, only the soft hum of crickets and a faint, far-off train that nobody really heard until much later, when memory began to rearrange itself. People would say she chose that night, that stillness, as if such moments were ever chosen. Others would insist something was not right, that a light in her small yellow house stayed on too long, or that she never would have opened the door at that hour. What lingers now is not the scene but a feeling, as though a curtain in someone's mind was gently pulled down, not ripped away. A sense that something precious had gone quiet before anyone thought to ask why. Eliza was 26 that autumn, with ink-stained fingers from grading papers and a voice that could hush an entire classroom without raising in volume. She taught literature at the high school in Lawson, a town in Tennessee that was small enough for everyone to wave, and large enough for secrets to move around unnoticed. Her students said she listened more than she spoke. Her neighbors said she smiled even when she looked tired. Her colleagues said she stayed late in the staff room, lost in essays and coffee gone cold. On the last day anyone saw her alive, she dismissed her class with an odd gentleness, as if reluctant to let them go. One student recalled, years later, that she paused by the window and watched the early falling leaves longer than usual. Another remembered how she asked the class to write about the kindest lie you ever told, then laughed softly when they objected that kindness and untruth did not belong in the same sentence. That evening, a thin fog settled over Lawson, softening shapes, turning street lamps into halos. Eliza's house sat 3 blocks off the main road, a modest one-story place with a white porch swing and a mailbox that still carried her maiden name. Inside, there were signs of a life mid-sentence. A book left open on the arm of the faded green sofa, a pot on the stove with water not yet boiled, a cardigan draped over the back of a chair as though her shoulders had grown suddenly warm. She was found in her bedroom the next morning by her younger sister, Nora. The room itself held an almost respectful order. Nothing obviously disturbed, nothing broken, nothing dramatic, just Eliza lying on the neatly made bed, as though she had lain down to rest and forgotten to rise again. The details, even then, felt uncertain. A small bottle on the nightstand, its label ordinary, its contents questionable. A half-drafted letter folded once, no name at the top. A window slightly open though the night had been cool. The local authorities spoke in patient, careful tones. They did not rush to name it. Some suggested she had chosen to step away from the world, quietly, without asking anyone to understand. Others thought it strange that no note was found, no clear reason offered, especially for someone who once told a class that every ending, however brief, deserved context. In Lawson, grief did not arrive as an outcry but as a soft rearranging of days. The school hung a photograph of her in the hallway, framed but slightly crooked. Her students left handwritten pages tucked behind it, lines of poetry, apologies for missed assignments, confessions they had never given her in person. Nora packed up Eliza's house with unhurried hands, lingering over every small object, as if each one might open into an explanation. There were whispers, of course. A phone call heard late at night. A man's shadow seen at her door a week before. A disagreement in the grocery store with someone no one could later identify clearly. Yet when asked for detail, memories slipped away, like breath on a cold window. The report, when it was finally written, sounded more certain on paper than it felt in anyone's chest. The language was measured, outlining possibilities without embracing any one of them too tightly. No definitive indication. Circumstances unresolved. Further inquiry recommended. Still, the town learned to talk about Eliza's passing as if it had been gently decided, even if nobody could say why. It was easier that way. Easier to accept that some hearts simply grow quiet than to consider that someone else's hand might have been there, unseen. Nora did not argue with the official words. She carried a box of her sister's books home and stacked them in her own living room, spine against spine, like a small library of unfinished conversations. Some evenings she would open one at random, searching the margins for something, a line underlined twice, a note, the soft impression of Eliza's pen pressing a thought into the page. She never said out loud what she truly felt. That the night her sister left the world, it was not only a life that ended, but a question that had not yet learned how to be asked. In that unasked question, the case quietly settled into the town's foundations, becoming part of its ordinary days, like the low hum of electricity or the distant sound of that same far-off train. Years would pass before anyone heard it again. 2. A forgotten witness or document reopens the cold investigation. It began not with a revelation, but with a routine. In 2003, 22 years after Eliza's death, a clerk named Marion Foster was assigned to help clear out a storage room behind the Lawson County Record's office. The room was barely more than a narrow corridor lined with metal shelves, crammed with cardboard boxes that had absorbed the quiet of decades. Dust softened the edges of everything. The air held the scent of old paper and faint, forgotten ink. Marion was not looking for anything. She was thinking about her grocery list, her daughter's school project, and the ache in her feet. She sorted boxes into piles to digitize, to discard, to send somewhere else, moving by date, by fatting labels, by what her supervisor had marked in red pen years earlier. At the back of the room, she noticed a box that did not quite belong. There was no label on its front, only a small strip of masking tape across the top, written in a hurried hand, Harrow. The name stirred something hazy in her memory. Marion had been a teenager when Eliza died. She remembered hushed conversations at dinner, her mother lowering her voice, saying it was a sorrowful situation. She remembered the framed photograph in the school hallway, the woman with the tired, kind eyes. She pulled the box down and opened it. Inside lay a thin stack of documents, some clipped together, others folded. There were photographs taken in careful black and white, the edges soft, the light in them slightly off. A copy of the original report. A list of interviews conducted, names she mostly did not recognize. And near the bottom, almost as an afterthought, an envelope with no date, no official stamp, just a paperclip gone slightly rusty. The envelope contained a handwritten statement, 3 pages long, signed by someone named Caleb Moore. The ink had bled slightly with time, the looping handwriting leaning forward, as though the words had been anxious to leave the pen. "I am not sure if what I saw matters," it began, "but I have not been able to forget it." Marion read slowly at first, then again, more carefully. Caleb wrote about the night of Eliza's death, about walking home after closing up the hardware store, about cutting through the side street near her house. He described seeing a figure outside Eliza's window, watching from the shadows, a person whose shape he recognized but whose name he did not write. "I told myself it was nothing," the letter continued. "I believed it was not my place, but I can't shake the feeling that I failed her by saying nothing at all." The last lines were the simplest. "If this reaches someone who can still do something, I hope they will listen more than they judge. I hope they will understand that silence is not always indifference. Sometimes it is fear." There was a signature, a date written in a different, firmer hand at the bottom, November 3, 1981. It had been logged, it seemed, 3 weeks after Eliza's death. But there was no follow-up form, no record of an interview with Caleb, no additional pages to indicate that anyone had asked for more. The statement had been filed away, placed in this box, and left to sleep for over 20 years. Marion felt a slow unease, not sharp enough to be alarm, more like the feeling of suddenly noticing something that had always been there in the corner of a room. She carried the box to her supervisor, who frowned, read the pages, then gave a small, uncertain nod. "This should have gone to cold cases," he said quietly. "Maybe it got lost in the shuffle back then." Within a week, the box found its way to a different office on a different floor, where it rested on a desk that belonged to investigator Thomas Ellison. Ellison was not the kind of man stories were usually written about. He did not carry himself with dramatic tension or sharp pronouncements. He wore plain shirts, drank his coffee without sugar, and had a habit of staring at a file for long stretches before touching it. His colleagues said he listened more than he spoke, and when he did speak, his words came slowly, as though each one were being weighed for soundness. The Harrow box arrived between a file on long-distance fraud and an unresolved burglary from the late 80s. It might have joined the quiet stack of cases that Ellison intended to examine when there was space. But the handwriting on the envelope drew his attention, not the message at first, but the way the letters leaned forward, as if the writer had been trying to outrun his own reluctance. He read Caleb's statement once, then again, tracing the lines with his eyes. The description of the figure outside the window was careful but vague. No firm identification, only a way of standing that I had seen many times, and the way they held their shoulders, like they were carrying more than they could show. What held Ellison most was not the potential lead, but the undertone of regret. The way Caleb kept circling the idea of having been there, having seen something, yet choosing silence. The way he framed his confession not as information, but as an apology that had been too long delayed. Ellison set the statement down, then reopened the original report. The photographs, the scene notes, the interviews with teachers, neighbors, family. He noted the absence more than the presence, no mention of a Caleb more anywhere. No sign that anyone had responded to his letter. The case, in its original form, had lived at the edge of decision. Officially unresolved, unofficially leaning toward a quiet, unchallenged narrative. The new document did not provide clarity. It disturbed what little rest the story had found. He could have closed the box and placed it back on the shelf. The town had moved forward. Many of the people involved had grown older, moved away, learned to name their memories differently. To open the case again would be to unsettle all of that, to ask questions of people who had, perhaps, finally learned to sleep. Yet the words on the page tugged at him. Silence is not always indifference. Sometimes it is fear. He understood fear, not of danger, but of what might change if truth were spoken aloud. He had seen people hold back simple facts because they were afraid of what those facts would say about them, about the loyalties they had chosen, the small comforts they had protected. Ellison placed the statement on top of the other documents and closed the box with deliberate care, as if acknowledging that once it was opened again in earnest, nothing would be quite the same. The cold case was no longer only a question of what had happened in a small yellow house in 1981. It had become a question of what people had been willing to remember, and what they had quietly taught themselves to forget. He signed his name on the reopening form with a steady hand. It did not feel like the start of an investigation. It felt like opening a door onto a room that had been locked, not by force, but by consent. The past, he knew, rarely stayed where it was left. 3. Investigator focuses on human psychology more than physical clues. Ellison did not begin with the house. He began with the people who had lived around it. Others in his position might have driven first to the small yellow home, walked its rooms, traced its corners, searching for something that had been missed. But he believed the scene, after so much time, would tell him mostly what he already knew, that a young woman had once lived there, and that one night her heart had ceased its rhythm. Instead, his first visits were to living rooms and porches, to small kitchens with aging linoleum floors, to quiet corners of Lawson, where the past still sat at the edge of conversation. He carried the file with him but rarely opened it in front of anyone. The folder was a weight in his hand, not a script. He watched faces, the way they changed when he said her name. Some brightened with a kind of lingering affection, others softened into something more complex, not sorrow exactly, but a carefulness, like stepping back from a memory that might still be fragile. With each person, he began the same way. "I've been asked to look again at Eliza Harrow's passing," he would say gently. "I know it has been a long time. I'm not here to judge what was done then. I'm hoping to understand how it felt for the people who knew her." The phrasing mattered. He was not asking for facts alone. He was asking for the shape of their emotions, the small hesitations that often did not make it into official statements. Some were eager to speak. A former student, now in his 30s, told him how Eliza had stayed after class to encourage his stumbling attempts at poetry. He remembered her hands folded on the desk, the way she listened as though the words he barely managed to say were larger than they sounded. "She made silence feel safe," he said, then paused, realizing the weight of his own choice of words. "Like you didn't have to rush. I never thought I never believed she would choose to go." Ellison watched the man's eyes shift away, to the framed photographs on the mantelpiece, to the window, anywhere but directly back. There was no deceit there, only a familiar discomfort, the mind attempting to reconcile the memory of someone gentle with the idea of that same person stepping deliberately toward their own ending. Others answered his questions more cautiously. A neighbor described how Eliza would water her flowers in the evenings, sometimes humming, sometimes simply standing with the hose in hand, watching the ground drink. She spoke of a time Eliza had returned home with reddened eyes, carrying a stack of papers hugged close to her chest. "Did you ask what was wrong?" Ellison asked, though he suspected the answer. "No," the neighbor replied. She looked like she had already decided how much she could say. In each conversation, Ellison listened not only to the detail but to the pauses that followed, the moments when someone caught themselves, almost adding something more, then letting the words fall away. He did not push immediately. He allowed silence to stretch, to become a space in which people could lay down something they had carried too long. "Sometimes it's the smallest thing," he would say quietly when a person hesitated. "Something you told yourself was trivial at the time. Those details can stay with us." He knew that memory was less a record than a negotiation. People rearranged their recollections to live more gently with themselves. They edited out the places where they had turned away, or stayed quiet, or chosen comfort over honesty. His work, as he saw it, was not to peel those revisions back with force, but to let people discover that they were capable of looking again. The forgotten statement from Caleb Moore remained at the center of his attention, not because of what it described, but because of what it revealed about the person who wrote it. An earlier investigator might have looked at Caleb simply as a witness who failed to come forward. Ellison saw him as someone who had lived for decades with a private sense of having turned away at a crucial moment. He arranged to meet Caleb in person. Caleb, now in his 60s, lived in a small house on the outskirts of Lawson, surrounded by fields that had seen many seasons. He greeted Ellison on the porch with a reserved nod, his posture straight, his face lined in a way that suggested more thought than complaint. "I wondered when someone would come with that paper," he said as they stepped inside. Ellison did not take out the statement immediately. They sat at a kitchen table worn smooth by years of meals and conversations. There was a hum from the refrigerator, a clock ticking softly over the doorway. "I read what you wrote," Ellison began. "I was struck by how much you spoke about what you felt, not just what you saw." Caleb's eyes flickered briefly, then settled. "I waited too long," he said. "By the time I wrote that, it already felt late." "Late for what?" "For doing right by her." Ellison let the words linger. He could have moved directly to questions about the figure outside the window, the details that might lead to a name. Instead, he studied the way Caleb's hands rested on the table steady, but with a faint tension in the fingers. "What kept you from coming sooner?" he asked. Caleb looked down, a small, rueful smile touching his mouth. "I told myself I wasn't sure what I'd seen," he said. "That it could have been anyone, that I might have been wrong, but the truth is I knew enough. I had ties, understandings, like everyone in a place like this." "Loyalties," Ellison said softly. Caleb nodded. "I'd grown up here. We all did favors. We all looked away now and then for people we liked, people we owed." The admission was not dramatic. It came out quietly, almost matter of fact, as if acknowledging the small, invisible bargains that form the backbone of a town. "Did you recognize the person you saw?" Ellison asked. Another pause. Caleb's gaze shifted to the window, where fields stretched under a pale afternoon sky. "I recognized the way they stood," he said, "like they were waiting for something to end." "That could describe many people," Ellison observed. "Yes," Caleb replied. "But back then, there weren't many who would have stood outside her house at that hour, not without a reason." "You had a name in mind." Caleb closed his eyes briefly, then opened them again. "I did," he said. "I still do, but saying it changes who I was then, doesn't it? It means admitting I could have spoken and didn't." Ellison heard the conflict in that. To name someone now was to expose an old reluctance, to make visible the distance between what Caleb had done and what he could have done. "I'm not here to condemn who you were," Ellison replied. "I'm here because whatever you saw has stayed with you. That matters." Caleb exhaled slowly. "I've carried it like a small stone in my pocket," he said. "Most days I barely feel it, and then something happens, a siren in the night, a young teacher in the paper, and suddenly it's heavy again." It was that image, more than any description of the shadow at the window, that lodged in Ellison's mind. A stone carried for decades, shape unchanged, weight shifting depending on the day. "I will ask you for the name," Ellison said gently. "Not because a word on my file will solve everything, but because speaking it may be the only way to set it down." Caleb looked at him for a long moment. There was no dramatic revelation in his gaze, only the quiet calculation of someone choosing between two kinds of discomfort. When he finally spoke the name, it arrived without flourish, landing lightly in the space between them. A familiar name in Lawson, one Ellison had already seen in the file, though not in any context that suggested suspicion. The sound of it did not bring clarity. It brought a new kind of uncertainty, the sense that what had once been taken for kindness might have held other currents beneath its surface. As Ellison left the house, he realized that every step forward in this case did not narrow possibilities, it broadened them. The truth, he felt, was not a single line waiting to be traced, but a web of choices, each tied to someone's quiet effort to live with themselves. It was that web he would have to follow, thread by thread, knowing that each answer would not settle the story but shift its weight. He drove back toward town, the small yellow house still untouched, its rooms waiting, while the people who had once moved around it began, slowly, to remember what they had taught themselves not to say. Ellison approached the next steps with the same calm gait he carried through every part of his work, though inside he felt the faint tremor of something stirring, not certainty, but the gentle awareness that people change when their past is touched. The name Caleb had whispered hovered like a delicate thread. Samuel Renford, a former colleague of Eliza, known then for his quiet wit, his soft-spoken support, and a gentleness many in Lawson still described in the present tense. Ellison visited Samuel not as an accuser, but as someone trying to understand the emotional fabric of another era. Samuel's home bore signs of a comfortable but modest life. Books arranged with deliberate care, a teapot warming on a small stove, an armchair tucked near a window, ready for someone who spent long evenings in thought. When Ellison mentioned Eliza, Samuel's expression changed only subtly, a soft tightening near the mouth, a fleeting downward glance. Not guilt, or if it was guilt, it was the kind that had been lived with long enough to become part of the face itself. "We all admired her," Samuel said after a quiet pause. "She carried a kind of calm with her. You'd think she never lost her way inside her own mind." Ellison listened without notes, eyes resting softly on Samuel's hands, which folded and unfolded with quiet restlessness. "Did you see her often outside the school?" Samuel hesitated, not dramatically, just a small pause that echoed louder than any spoken word. "Sometimes," he said, "we talked about books. She'd bring essays to discuss. It was nothing unusual, only two people sharing the same curiosities." He offered a gentle smile, though it didn't quite reach the eyes. Ellison didn't push. He let the silence grow long enough for Samuel to shift his weight in his chair, for thought to ripple across his expression. "Why reopen it now?" Samuel asked softly. "It's been so many years." "Because someone who cared for her stayed quiet," Ellison replied, "and quietness can change shape over time." Samuel nodded, gaze drifting toward the window as though the past waited outside, watching through the glass. "There are things we told ourselves back then," he murmured, "things we believed were harmless. I suppose time has a way of unwrapping them." The conversation ended with no sharp edges, no overt implication, only a subtle sense that another layer had shifted slightly, revealing fragments of a connection more complex than the records had shown. Next came Nora, Eliza's sister, who received Ellison with soft eyes and a guarded calm. She had aged gently, her voice carrying the warmth of someone who had learned to move through sorrow without bitterness. When Ellison mentioned Samuel's name, she looked down, fingers closing loosely over the edge of a cushion. "They were close," she said finally, "closer than most people realized. Eliza trusted him, but she also worried he expected more understanding from her than she could offer." Ellison felt the implication settle like a feather, a relationship shadowed by mismatched emotional weight. "Did they argue?" "Not exactly," Nora replied. "It wasn't raised voices, more like pauses that grew too long or things she didn't say because she didn't want to hurt him. Sometimes," Nora continued, "Eliza would come home with a distant expression, as though carrying someone else's sorrow in her hands. When pressed, she would only say, 'I can't always give people the reassurance they want.'" This, Ellison realized, reflected the quiet tension that threaded through many bonds, the subtle pressure of emotional expectation, the longing for closeness paired with the fear of disappointing another's hope. Multiple relationships began to echo similar patterns. A colleague remembered Samuel waiting by Eliza's classroom door one afternoon, looking weighed by unspoken worry. A neighbor recalled seeing him walking down her street more frequently during those autumn weeks. A former student mentioned overhearing a conversation where Samuel murmured something about needing more clarity, though Eliza had responded with calm restraint. None of it was damning, none of it concrete, but each recollection added texture, forming a portrait of two people navigating a bond neither fully understood, where affection blurred into something heavier, unnamed. Still, Ellison held no accusations. What he carried instead was the quiet impression of lives intertwined with tenderness, misunderstanding, and unbalanced emotional yearning. Relationships, he thought, often turned ambiguous not through malice but through longing, the kind that grows complicated when gratitude feels like something more, and silence becomes easier than confessing one's limits. In such spaces, suspicion did not feel like the enemy. It felt like a shadow cast by the very moments people had once mistaken for light. 5. Old secrets unfold, revealing betrayal and hidden personal motives. Ellison continued gently, as though peeling petals from a flower long pressed between the pages of time, careful not to break what remained delicate. With each conversation, the past shed a new layer, offering not certainty but emotional echoes that deepened the mystery. He revisited the school, walking down the quiet corridor where Eliza's photograph still hung. Students passed, unaware of the weight that lingered in the air. The staff room smelled faintly of markers and old wood. A retired teacher, Mrs. Alden, sat across from him with a cup of tea trembling slightly in her hands. "I always felt," she said in a hushed voice, "that Eliza carried something heavy inside her, not sadness exactly, more like the burden of someone else's hope." "What do you mean?" "There was someone," she continued carefully, "who leaned on her more than she realized, someone who asked for guidance when they truly needed boundaries." Ellison felt the idea settle in his chest. Emotional closeness could disguise itself as mentorship, companionship, even affection. But when dependence grew unbalanced, it could quietly strain the person offering comfort. "She told me once," Mrs. Alden added, "that she worried about disappointing someone she cared for. I asked her who. She smiled, but I could see she wasn't at ease." Other fragments emerged in similar ways. A colleague recalled overhearing Eliza apologize softly to someone, saying, "I didn't mean for it to feel misleading." A student remembered Samuel leaving the school abruptly one afternoon, eyes distant, carrying papers that weren't his. An administrative aide mentioned finding a discarded note in the staff room trash, torn in half, with Eliza's handwriting. "I wish you understood that kindness doesn't always mean I can be everything you need." None of these discoveries were dramatic. They were whispers, half-shadows, the kinds of truths people hide not out of deceit, but out of quiet hope that everything might settle without hurt. Ellison realized these weren't secrets in the conventional sense. They were emotional fault lines. Subtle betrayals born not from cruelty but from blurred expectations. Perhaps Samuel felt she owed him something unspoken. Perhaps Eliza sensed the shifting weight of that connection. Perhaps their closeness was shaped less by romance and more by intertwined uncertainties. Ellison noticed how even now, decades later, people softened their words when speaking of Samuel. They described him as gentle, misunderstood, tender-hearted, someone who never meant harm. But emotional harm is rarely deliberate. It often arrives through longing, silence, or unspoken hope, through the desire to be needed, through the quiet wish to be someone's center even when they never promised such a place. The more Ellison listened, the more he felt the emotional symmetry. Eliza trying not to wound someone who leaned toward her with unbalanced affection. Samuel wishing for clarity that Eliza could not offer without complicating their bond. A community choosing not to notice the tension, comforting themselves with the assumption that kindness always safeguards those involved. But kindness can complicate. It can tether people in ways they never intended, creating soft betrayals that unfold slowly, quietly, and without intention. And in the very center of that delicate web, Ellison sensed a truth forming, not about guilt or innocence, but about human longing that had settled into the spaces between them. He left the school with the file heavier than when he had entered, though no new evidence had been added. What grew heavier was the realization that emotional sincerity could coexist with unseen harm, and that loyalty could be twisted beautifully, painfully, into something that resembled betrayal without ever meaning to be. The past, Ellison understood, rarely revealed villains. It revealed people doing their best with fragile hearts. 6. Twist exposes the innocent as manipulative and morally ambiguous. The truth emerged not abruptly, but like dawn, gradually, softly, and without permission. Ellison returned to speak with Caleb again, sensing the older man had not yet fully released the memory that had weighed on him for decades. This time, Caleb opened his door before Ellison knocked, as if expecting him. "I've remembered something," Caleb said with a quiet gravity. "Or maybe I've finally stopped pretending I didn't." They sat at the same kitchen table, the quiet hum of the refrigerator filling the silence between them. Caleb took a long breath. "The night I passed her house, I didn't see Samuel move toward the window. I saw him step back from it, as if he'd been speaking to her." Ellison leaned forward slightly but kept his tone soft. "Speaking? Through the window?" "No, I think he had just come from inside." The words hung in the room like a gentle tremor, not an accusation, more like a painful acknowledgement. But Caleb's next admission shifted something deeper. "There's a reason I didn't say anything back then," he murmured. "Samuel came to me the next morning. He wasn't upset, not the way you'd expect. He was calm, almost comforting. He told me he'd heard I passed by the neighborhood. Said he hoped I wouldn't misunderstand. He said he'd been trying to help her through something personal, something delicate." Caleb's brow tightened, as though the memory itself carried a bitter sweetness. "He thanked me," Caleb whispered. "He thanked me for staying quiet, and he did it with such sincerity, such gentle reassurance that I believed him." Ellison felt the weight of those words sink slowly. A man who reassured others so softly that they trusted him without questioning. A man known for gentleness, kindness, quiet understanding. A man who could use tenderness not as a weapon, but as a veil. Caleb continued, "He made me feel like speaking up would hurt someone fragile. That silence was the kindest choice." And Ellison understood. Some people manipulate not by demanding, but by softly guiding others, guilt into loyalty. By making their preferences feel like compassion. By giving comfort while quietly shaping the narrative around them. Samuel had not been harsh, nor forceful, nor cruel. His mistake was subtler. He leaned on people using gentle words, trusting smiles, soft suggestions, the kind no one recognized as influence. He had shaped Caleb's silence by making it feel righteous. He had shaped Eliza's restraint by framing his needs as delicate. He had shaped the community's assumptions with a reputation for warmth that no one wanted to question. None of this made him malicious, but it made him far from innocent. It made him a man who believed his emotional needs deserved understanding, even when those needs quietly pressed against someone else's boundaries. Ellison saw it now. The twist was not about guilt. It was about how easily one person's softness could bend the choices of those around them. How sincerity, when mixed with unspoken longing, could subtly shift another's life. How emotional reliance could masquerade as vulnerability, drawing sympathy instead of scrutiny. Samuel Renford had not meant harm. But meaning is only part of truth. The rest lies in the subtle ways he shaped silence into protection for himself, not for Eliza. Ellison left Caleb's home with a heavy understanding. Sometimes the most morally ambiguous person is the one everyone believes harmless. Because harmlessness, when leaned on too heavily, can take on its own quiet form of influence. The past, now, was less a mystery than a portrait of gentle contradictions, the kind no court could prosecute, but which still left a mark on every person involved. 7 concludes with open-ended moral tone, hiding truth saves someone. Ellison did not write a formal conclusion in the file. There was no declaration, no final statement, no phrase that tidied the fragments into a single narrative. Instead, he walked the town one last time, past the school, past the old record office, past the yellow house whose windows now reflected only the quiet street. He visited Nora, offering her the truth not as accusation but as understanding. Sometimes, he said gently, people lean on others without knowing the weight they place. Nora listened, her eyes soft, her breath steady. She did not ask for a name. She already sensed the shape of the story. "And does knowing help?" she asked softly. Ellison hesitated. "It explains, but explanations aren't the same as comfort." Nora smiled faintly, the kind of smile that holds years inside it. "Eliza once told me that some truths are doors you can open only if you're ready for what stands behind them. Maybe this one can stay half open." Ellison let her decide what that meant. He left without giving her anything definitive. No blame, no absolution, only space for interpretation, for peace or something close to it. Later that evening, Ellison met Samuel for a final conversation. They sat on the porch as the sky dimmed into dusk. Samuel spoke of memories, of admiration, of wanting to be someone she could depend on. There was no confession, no denial, only a long, quiet reflection of a man looking back at choices he never questioned deeply enough. "Do you think I hurt her?" Samuel asked at last. Ellison looked toward the horizon, where soft colors blended without borders. "I think you cared for her," he answered gently. "And sometimes caring becomes complicated when we don't realize how much we expect in return." Samuel bowed his head slightly, accepting the ambiguity as truth. In the end, Ellison closed the case not with certainty, but with understanding. He filed the documents with deliberate slowness, aware that solving something does not always mean settling it. The file remained officially unresolved. Unofficially, Ellison knew the emotional picture was clear enough, but clarity, he realized, could also wound. And sometimes, protecting people from the sharpness of truth was its own quiet form of justice. Years later, the story lingered in Lawson like a soft echo. Some believed the case had been solved quietly. Some believed it remained untouched. Some never thought of it again. But those who carried a piece of it, Nora, Caleb, Samuel, Ellison, learned to live with gentle contradictions. Truth that brought understanding but no comfort. Memory that softened but never fully settled. A story that ended not with revelation, but with a quiet decision to let certain doors remain only partially open. And in that half-light, the question of justice remained suspended, not denied, not affirmed, but resting where human hearts often leave complicated stories. Somewhere between sorrow and forgiveness. Between knowledge and silence. Between what is spoken and what is allowed to remain softly, deliberately, unanswered.